everyone. Thank you so much for coming to another Room for Discussion event. I'm John Paul. I'm here with Thomas. And today we'll be interviewing Professor Sander van der Linden. He's a professor at Cambridge. He's written 2 books, one of which is Foolproof, which has been awarded the best Financial Times book of 2023. He's also written The Psychology of Misinformation.
Yes, we will dive very deep into the world of misinformation. What makes misinformation behave and spread like a virus? And what is the role and responsibility of social media companies in this? We will see whether the CEO of Meta, Mark Zuckerberg, is right in calling fact-checking ineffective and harmful to free speech. And we will ask Professor van der Linden about his experience with working with these companies on developing a vaccine against misinformation. We will also get very practical and ask him, what can we do when a family, a member or a friend is deep down the rabbit hole of misinformation and conspiracy theories? Is there a way out, or is it just a one-way ticket in?
Without further ado, please welcome Professor Sander van der Linden.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thanks very much. You have a very comfy couch here.
It is indeed.
Can you hear me okay?
I think it's off.
Let's see. If you maybe speak.
Oh, there we go. Oh,
Yes.
Wow.
All right. Well,
Now it's on.
thank you for being here, Professor van der Linden. It's really
Pleasure.
great to welcome you here. We wanted to start with getting a sense on how big the problem we're dealing with actually is. Since you're an expert in the field, how often yourself have you fallen for misinformation or fake news?
Well, actually, I've fallen for misinformation at least a few times. There's a example in the book where I actually talk about my wife was. I think it was 2 years ago, a little bit longer, where we were anticipating some NASA landing on, some rover landing on Mars. And she shared a social media post with me that was some wind sounds on Mars, really. It was, it looked impressive. And so I had this notion that I was expecting the rover landing. So I thought, oh, is that what wind sounds like on Mars? And so I was impressed all day by this video, but then it turned out to be totally fake. And the interesting thing is that it was a real rover landing, just not from this year. And so it was like a clever merge of like a real landing with a real wind sound from some other expedition. And the producers of this video were obviously, they knew that people were anticipating. Right, so the brain was looking for this information, looking to confirm it, and so they probably anticipated that we would be more vulnerable, or that you could exploit some viral process on social media, because it did went viral. A journalist shared it. Stephen King even shared it. And usually I trust Stephen King on social media, and so I was duped. I was duped by that, and that's not the only time that I've been duped. So I don't think that there's. People say like, oh, I'm so smart, or like, I'm educated. Fake news is not for me. There's always this sort of othering effect that fake news is for the plebes, for the dumb people over there. I'm not susceptible to misinformation, but I don't think it's true. I think we're all susceptible to misinformation just because of the way the brain works. And some people more, some people are more susceptible than others. Some people find themselves in environments, right, that are more conducive to misinformation circulation than other environments. But I think at a basic level, it's actually really easy to trick people. We do it all the time in the lab. Some journalists once asked me why I developed an interest in this. When I was in high school, I found it quite interesting to dupe other people, and so I would come to class and I would tell everyone that the exam had been moved to next day, to the day afterwards. And I found it curious that people would just pack up their bags and leave the room. Of course, I debriefed everyone before they actually left the high school. Right? I said, look, I'm just messing with you guys. It is really there is an exam. And then I figured out it works better if there was already some half-baked rumor going around that it may be moved at some point, and again, it sort of confirms people's suspicions. So, and then I started people telling, random things like, have you read this news about this new frog that has 10 legs? And people would just go along and like, oh, that's fascinating, And I realized that actually, most of the time we're not critically processing information when you don't have an easy way to disconfirm. So, I mean, this was before, I guess, the rise of social media and the internet. But, and I sort of gained this reputation of somebody who's always joking around and saying things. And then obviously I would always tell people that I was just messing with them. But that actually led to my interest in psychology and like, how is it possible why do we believe things when we're told information? How does that work? And can you actually do these? Then I found out people do these experiments for a living. And that's what I ended up doing. So I'm still duping people today.
Yes, so tricking people, you've made a career out of it.
Yeah.
But misinformation, what even is misinformation? Like we have fake news, disinformation. Like, can you kind of explain the terms for us a bit?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it kind of ties into your question about, how prevalent is it? And I think, when you talk about how prevalent is misinformation, it depends on your definition. I mean, if you want to define misinformation as something extremely narrow, like people who believe in flat Earth, 100% false claims, then you could say, most people are not exposed to flat Earth theories all day long, so maybe it's not that big of a problem, right? But if you define it as not just stuff that's 100% false, but also information that's misleading in some way, right? That it leads to misperceptions because you've used a manipulation technique. You present opinion as fact. You leave out critical context. You use a certain framing to throw people off, logical fallacies. Then hyper-partisan, content that's meant to polarize people. Then actually it becomes a big problem because misleading information is very prevalent. And so it's sort of, conspiracy theories are quite prevalent. In fact, about a third of the population in any given country believes at least in some conspiracy theory. I mean, a third of the country, that's these are pretty decent numbers. So I think it depends a little bit on your misinformation, on your definition of misinformation. But misinformation as a concept is just information that's false or misleading, right? That's how I've defined it. I should say I chaired a consensus report for the American Psychological Association, and we had this big debate about how to define it. Should it be stuff that's only false or stuff that's false and or misleading? And we settled on the latter because if you look at the impact of misinformation, the stuff that's misleading has a much bigger impact, on people in terms of outcomes. There was a study in Science, for example, that showed that fact-checked misinformation, which tends to be the stuff that's 100% usually 100% false, had a negative impact on, let's say, vaccine intentions. But a headline that was misleading but not 100% false, the impact was 50 times bigger on people's vaccination intentions. So the headline was, healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. And so a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine. It's just one had nothing to do with the other. So it's a correlation-causation fallacy. It's falsely implies that there is a relationship. It's missing context. So it has all of sort of the ingredients of being highly misleading, but technically not false. Oh. And that's the stuff that psychologically I think is much more dangerous and actually gets to people much more than some outrageous claim that most people don't believe in. So by that definition, misinformation is consequential. And then disinformation is misinformation with some intention to deliberately and explicitly harm or deceive people, right? It's intentional. And propaganda is disinformation in the service of some agenda, commercial agenda, political agenda, and that's kind of how I distinguish the three. So we don't like to use the term fake news very much because it's non-specific. So I'd say misinformation, right, false or misleading but not intentional, disinformation, intentional propaganda, intentional disinformation for commercial or political purposes.
I think we can all agree that misinformation, disinformation is both very harmful to society at large, but you have actually called it one of the defining problems of our age. Is that really warranted? Is it that big of a problem?
Well, actually, there's some people who think that misinformation is not a problem at all, they sort of think about the problem as, well, wasn't there always propaganda? Hasn't there always been misinformation? Maybe we should just let that be, and maybe it's something you can't really define, or who knows what are facts? You can get very postmodern and just sort of rotate around things you can't define, and then if you can't define, you can't act, and so bad actors can then weaponize that line of reasoning, which they did with climate change, smoking, and lung cancer, right? That if you keep casting doubt on the science and you keep saying that actually you can't define things, then policymakers don't know what to do about it. And so actually, there are people who sort of have this sort of deliberate strategy of trying to minimize a problem. Then there are people who are serious, right? Who are trying to think, okay, what's the scale of this problem? How big of a problem is it? The reason, I would say most people think that misinformation is a problem, right? That it's harmful to people individually and society at large. And I think there's two different ways of thinking about the harms of misinformation. I think the obvious type of harm that we all think about is like, okay, I read something on social media, I ingest methanol, and now I'm hospitalized because it turns out it didn't cure COVID. And those things do happen, right? And they're harmful. Or I'm not going to get vaccinated because I believe in a conspiracy theory. And those things are harmful to people's individual health. But and in fact, in the global south, in India, for example, false rumors about kidnappers have led people to lynch entire mobs based on false rumors, right? And so in the UK, we've had national riots that erupted because of a fake news story that, there was a stabbing, which was tragic, and then there was fake news that the assailant came by boat, that he was an illegal immigrant, an asylum seeker who came by boat, and it was total fake news, 100% false. But that set off, a huge kind of violent riot. So you can have sort of larger societal consequences too. And of course, there's many things in there. There's polarization, there's anti-immigration attitudes, there's distrust. But when I say that misinformation is one of the defining problems of our time, I think of it as a meta risk, right? So we have lots of risks in society. There's pandemics, there's climate change, right? There's cybersecurity, AI threats. But all of those are complicated by the spread of misinformation. Policymakers can be led astray. Sometimes people don't think climate change is a hoax. What if the leader of a country thinks that climate change is a hoax, right? Because of misinformation, spreads that to other people who then believe it's misinformation. So misinformation can derail climate change. Misinformation can derail a pandemic. Great if you have a vaccine. Not so great if people don't want to take it because they believe in misinformation. The first casualty of war is truth, right? So in wartime, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Hamas, huge amount of propaganda, misinformation that can have deadly consequences for people. So I think misinformation amplifies all other risks in some way, and that's why I think it's one of the defining challenges of our time, because it cumulatively builds over time, and those are the indirect consequences, right? Misinformation erodes trust in institutions, in each other, in media. Doesn't happen overnight, but it sort of creeps up and it cumulatively builds. And that's more difficult to measure and more difficult to quantify than the direct sort of harms, but nonetheless quite important. I mean, Hitler didn't convince Germany overnight that we should be putting minorities in concentration camps. I mean, he started off with something that sounded way more relatively less threatening to people, right? Just a little bit. Maybe these people, maybe there's something wrong with them. Or like, maybe our economic issues are due to this other group of people, right? Not an unfamiliar narrative in geopolitics at the moment. And then once you get people on board with a small nugget of questionable information, then you go to the next level and to the next level. And then over years, it builds, and you prepare people for genocide. And I think that that's the risk that sometimes we underestimate with misinformation. And so, look at the U.S. at the moment. I mean, there's just a fire hose of constant misinformation. And you can say, I mean, some of it is nonsense. People don't believe it. But it's the gist. People might not literally believe it, but it's the gist that seeps in and kind of infects our thinking about society over the longer term. And
unconsciously, right?
Yeah.
It works unconsciously. Yeah.
It's very insidious. And it's you mentioned that it's almost like a virus, and actually in your book, Foolproof, you do make that claim, right? That misinformation is like a virus, it's like an infectious disease. Why do you use this analogy?
Yes. So a lot has been said about this analogy. I like the analogy from a modeling perspective. So I think sometimes people misunderstand it, right? So I've had chats with philosophers or people who work in the humanities who are sometimes a bit iffy about the metaphor that your mind can be infected by a virus, because it sounds a bit scary, right? Our ideas really viruses and things like that. And so I just find it interesting from an information propagation perspective. So, when I started working on this, we use models from epidemiology that are used to study the spread of COVID, for example, like the susceptible, infected, recovered model. And you can use those pretty much one-to-one on the spread of information, including misinformation. So, a lot of these models, they're viral contagion models, right? That's how misinformation spreads in networks too. And you can use those models to predict things. How many people will it infect? How far will it spread? If you introduce solutions, can you stem the spread of misinformation? And in these models, there's some simplifying assumptions, right? That there's a rumor. Now somebody tweets it at you, somebody sends it to you on social media, right? You're a node in a network, and then you share it with somebody else, and they share it with somebody else, and this would be a sort of asymptomatic, it can be asymptomatic spread. You don't really believe it, but you share it with other people, right? Or you could actually believe it, and then you go out and you sort of proselytize and try to get other people on board with the information. And those epidemiological models you can make more complex. So like a simple contagion is kind of a one and done situation. Like somebody sneezes on you and you get infected with the virus. Kind of the same with information. Somebody shares a rumor, you think it's interesting, you share it with somebody else. But some things are more complex, right? That people don't become vaccine hesitant overnight. So maybe you need to be exposed to misinformation from people you trust in your network multiple times, which is more of what we call a complex contagion. But you can do that with misinformation too, right? So you can have multiple exposures to misinformation from people you trust. And so you can build that into the model. And so actually it turns out that these epidemiological models of viral spread work really well for understanding the diffusion of misinformation at just a basic kind of quantitative computational level. And so that's where I started thinking about this analogy. And then later on, I'm sure we'll get to the inoculation, vaccination part. It kind of just fit together as a computational framework, right? I don't think that people walk around with some, empty, mind ready to become infected. I mean, that's not the right way to think about it. I think we all have differential susceptibility, which is also true for viruses, right? And so some of us are more susceptible to COVID than other people. And it's the same with the mind, right? It's not that the mind is just there waiting to be infected, but we have differential susceptibility. And then you can model things in a much more specific way, and it allows for interesting insights, scientific insights about how does information spread, why do we, how does it, quote unquote, infect people, and what can we do about it? And that's kind of the framework that underlies the book.
Then the question is, does our mind also have an immune system?
Right. Yes. Now, this is a bit more controversial.
Please.
So we published a follow-up paper, which was more of a sort of philosophical paper, where I teamed up with some philosophers. And the question is, does the mind have an immune system more generally? And this is actually based on the notion, taking lots of findings in psychology, not just about misinformation now, but it seems that the mind seems to be recruiting defenses against ideas it doesn't like, just as the body recruits defenses to invaders that it doesn't like. And so a lot of what I do about inoculation is actually related to activating mental immunity against misinformation.
Could you maybe explain inoculation for the audience?
Should we do that first? Yeah.
Yes.
So a lot of the work that we do is related around the psychological theory known as inoculation theory, which follows the biomedical analogy. So the whole idea is that instead of just giving people more facts and education, which of course is always good, but you actually expose people to a weakened dose of misinformation. And then you deconstruct and refute that misinformation in advance so people can build up cognitive immunity to future misinformation. And so it works at the same level of the vaccine analogy, where you expose the body to a weakened or inactivated strain of a virus, right, to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance to future infection. And turns out you can do the same with the mind. So you preemptively expose people to a small weakened dose of the techniques that are used to manipulate people. You deconstruct and refute them in advance, and then people build up cognitive resistance. And you can measure those cognitive antibodies too. How well can people discern between manipulative, non-manipulative information? How good are people at counter-arguing, at resisting? How motivated are they in terms of producing the response? Some research shows physiological responses that, it's kind of a elicitation of a threat in some way. And so people produce, sweat gland activity when they feel that there's threatening information that they have to resist. So there's a lot of analogies with the biological system in that sense. The larger question of whether the mind is an immune system is a bit more intractable in the sense that you would need lots of different lines of converging evidence for that. But we are planning some interesting neurological studies looking at what does resistance to misinformation look like in terms of substrates in the brain and differential kind of activity. Can we predict and forecast based on neurological activity, how people will respond to real-world inoculations, for example, which has been done in the context of public health, which is actually very interesting. So take a small group of people, look at their brain activity in response to a public health message, and then predict how they will respond to a real-world campaign. And they find actually that brain activity predicts it better than people's self-reported responses. And so you can imagine similar things with these sort of inoculation against misinformation campaigns.
Right. So at some point during the COVID-19 crisis, I believe in the United Kingdom, there were people setting 5G towers on fire.
Right, yes.
I also believe you studied some of those cases. So is this a situation where the immune system gets breached? How do these people get as far that they set 5G towers on fire?
Yeah, and so that's another thing, right? So people say, okay, misinformation, but like how many people go on and set towers on fire? In fact, in the UK alone, there was about 50 towers that were set on fire, which causes infrastructure damage, right? So that's a real problem. And it's about tail risks too, right? That if you look at the average of the population, then most people are not going to go and set phone towers on fire, but it's about what's the risk at the tail ends of the distribution, and how much damage can they do when radicalized. And so actually, if you look, it's very unequal, right? Some communities find themselves in nice, factual, scientific environments, and other communities are drowning in misinformation. And so there's a huge amount of what we call information inequality. So people don't have access to high-quality information sometimes. Maybe they do, maybe they're motivated not to consume it. Maybe they live in an echo chamber, right, where they're just surrounded by low-quality information and they can't get out of it, whereas other people don't. And so some of the people that I talked to for the book that have been doing this stuff, including former neo-Nazis, people who set phone masts on fire, other extremists, people on far right, manosphere movements. Often they seem to be part of. They seem to be alienated, marginalized in some way. They have a high level of distrust. They don't feel like they're getting what they deserve in life, and then they turn to alternative media to try to consume. So they find another community that's perpetuating low-quality information, conspiracy theories. Then they start validating that in their own circle, and then they start closing themselves off from other sources of information, so you become more radical. And then the tension kind of builds, and then one day they just feel like they need to do something about it because they've been thinking about this all day, every day for the last couple of weeks. They've been in online chat rooms talking to other people about it, and the guy that I talked to in the UK, yeah, just brought some tools, thought enough was enough, and he drove out. And he just set a phone mast on fire. And he honestly believed at the time that 5G was making people ill. And like the guy at Pizzagate who walked into the pizza store with a semi-automatic rifle because he thought Hillary Clinton was running a sex trafficking ring in the basement, honestly thought there were little children being held hostage, right? And so often I think these people develop genuine ideas of harm that they want to rectify. It's not necessarily that they're agents of chaos and want to go out and just cause the most damage. They often feel like there's a sinister conspiracy happening and that they need to do something about it.
It's almost like they feel they're doing something good,
Yes.
something heroic. Like everyone's getting sick from 5G, so I'm gonna jump in my car and just burn down the 5G tower.
Exactly.
So you mentioned in the book that identity plays a very big role in believing misinformation, but like it's kind of a big switch, right? Because like how does identity play a role in suddenly thinking the Earth is flat or the moon landing is fake? All of these
Right.
conspiracy theories, like.
Yeah, so I mean, identity is a big topic. I would say that some misinformation it gets at people without an identity component, right? So some things are just false, and people are duped by them because they're not engaging in critical sort of information consumption. We receive information all the time from lots of sources, so the brain's overwhelmed. So when the brain's overwhelmed, it reduces to rules of thumb or heuristics, right? Do I like this person? Have I heard this before, for example? It's a fluency heuristic. Does it fit with what I want to be true about the world? And that's then how information gets categorized. When misinformation plays into social identities, it gets even trickier. So we all have multiple identities, right? So the US is hyperpolarized. So in the US, people often talk about liberal, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. People have two types of identities. But reality is much more complex, of course. We belong to, sports clubs, chess clubs, university clubs, social clubs. We also have political identities. And so misinformation can try to, when you talk to producers of misinformation, they obviously try to design the information to tap into people's long-held identities. So for example, in the wellness space, there's a sort of huge wellness grift. So people who really care, this is an unusual identity, but it's very interesting. People who care a lot about their own wellness and health and well-being often then go on Instagram or TikTok and get stuck in all of these, crazy rabbit holes about shoving coffee up your rectum, for a good cleaning, and it's motivated by this identity to want to be healthy, right? You're trying all the stuff that goes viral on Instagram, all the shakes and the powders and the how to build muscle or whatever. It's all unverified, mostly low quality information, but they're playing into people's sense of I want to be healthy. How can I do it fast? Without any effort. They know people don't have time, right? They want to get fast results. How to lose weight in 10 steps in 2 hours, right? Right, and so they play into that identity. Maybe something slightly more nefarious is conflict situations, right? People have very strongly held identities in conflict situations, right? And so they will try to design misinformation that activates people's identity based on where they are in the conflict. If you're on this side, they're going to frame the misinformation in a way that's going to activate feelings of marginalization and harm on this side. If you're on that side of the conflict, they're going to try to portray it in one way that activates, a different type of identity. Think about politics, right? Obviously, that political identity can be very salient to people. So a lot of misinformation is framed in terms of your politics, not in terms of nuances about what the right policy is in a given situation, but in terms of where your identity is. I mean, in the US, it's extreme. Things in the Netherlands are also quite interesting, from what I hear at the moment. And so it's about activating your political identity around immigration or climate change, right? So a lot of the misinformation tries to avoid nuanced discussions about policies and instead get people ramped up about the groups that they care about. And I think in the US it gets to such an unhealthy level that it doesn't matter what the issue is, you're just saying something because it bolsters the identity of the group that you belong to. Right? We all belong to different groups, and part of who we are is actually defined by the relationships of the groups that we identify with. So this is called social identity theory, right? And so that's kind of a basic mechanism. But the way to actually tap into that is we did this one experiment where we asked people to rate headlines, true or false. People were not so good at it, liberals, Democrats. And then they were mostly saying that stuff that was about the other group was false and stuff about their group was true. But then we offered them a financial incentive. So we said, we're actually going to give you $2 for the right answer. And then all of a sudden people know what the right answer is. So not everything, but for the most part, which actually signaled to us that what's happening is that they're expressing, to some extent, an identity rather than necessarily truly believing the misinformation themselves. It's kind of a way of signaling your identity. And so when misinformation becomes a way to signal identity rather than a matter of you've been duped and now it needs to be corrected in some way, right? Because identity is very resistant to correction.
And we've discussed like identity is a very powerful factor that makes people susceptible to misinformation. But a lot of times people nowadays dismiss like experts as like ivory tower elites.
Yeah.
It seems to be like a general mistrust towards our institutions, towards the government. Can you also explain this through like a psychological mechanism, or is this more a societal issue we're having at the moment?
You mean distrust in experts?
Yes.
Yeah. So actually, we did a survey in 68 countries in a paper that we recently published, and trust in science is pretty high actually across different countries, but it's lower amongst certain subgroups of people who have low trust in elites and experts, and so some of it doesn't break out neatly by ideology in every country. So, for example, in the Global South, in some Global South countries, it's actually the left who is trusting science less, whereas in Western Europe and the US, it tends to be the right who's trusting science and experts less. And so it's quite interesting. So I would say that trust is generally pretty decent, but it's low amongst certain subgroups. And it's hard to think of ways of how to build trust with those audiences, right? And I think if you look at the social cognition literature, which is about how do people perceive other people, there's like two basic dimensions, which is one is competence, like experts are perceived as useful because they're competent in what they do, but the other is warmth, and I feel like scientists are not very good at that. Warmth is like, you're also human, you have biases, you're not perfect, right? And people need to see you as a human sort of being. And I think experts are often downrated on that dimension. They're sort of cold robots and not, displaying the sort of warmth. So if you look at Trump, for example, and Elon Musk and those characters, so when people say that they like them, what they actually mean is there's this sort of difference between fact speak and belief speak. So experts tend to speak in facts and evidence, but characters like Trump and Musk and others in that category tend to speak their beliefs. So they have no regard for veracity of information. They just spout how they feel and what they think, regardless of what it's true. And people perceive that as authentic. And so the idea is that these people are more authentic because they're speaking truth to their beliefs, whereas experts just circle around abstract facts and science and hide in their ivory tower. And I think that creates an interesting contrast. So the question is, how can experts be more human in their communication, I think, without losing competence or compromising accuracy? So we created this game years ago called Bad News, and it was about helping inoculate people against misinformation. One of the things we did was we didn't call it a Cambridge sort of thing. We didn't say, here are these elites trying to tell you what you need to believe. We just put it online. Step into the shoes of a manipulator and let people find out what their tricks are. And it went viral, and a lot of the comments were like, I like how this is sarcastic and kind of makes fun of science, and and the whole thing was we weren't taking ourselves too seriously. We weren't talking down to people. We were just creating an intervention that we thought would be fun for the public and other people, meet people where they are, and show them some of the tricks of online manipulators in a simulated environment. You could make fun of the government. You can make fun of big corporations. You can choose your side, and you do see that people craft paths congenial to their preference in the game. But it allows for kind of a non-threatening environment, people to come to terms with, how online manipulation happens. And I think we need to do the same with regular audiences. Kind of like, as an expert on misinformation, I'm sometimes duped by misinformation because we're all human, right? I think that's the answer. Not so much that I'm an expert, I know everything, you don't know stuff, and I'm going to tell you, all the facts. And because we know from psychology that doesn't work very well, and it doesn't build trust. And the last thing I'll say, some people talk about displaying trustworthy behavior. Some people say, well, it's really about the fact that experts and institutions can't be trusted because they haven't shown trustworthy behavior in terms of, they've made errors during the pandemic, or they've all been radicalized by woke ideology, or, they've aren't researching issues that are relevant to more extreme parts, concerns that are seen as legitimate by more extreme parts of the population that are not on the agenda in educational institutions. And so, one of the questions is, how can we moderate extremism and have more nuanced discussions and sort of diversify the concerns that the population, has in sort of a two-way conversation that could help mediate, some of the cleavages and some of the polarization that we're seeing. Of course, without affirming misinformation, without affirming conspiracy theories, but I think there is some middle ground to be reached. Let me give you one last example that and yes, I was talking to Jonathan Haidt the other day at NYU. He has this book, The Anxious Generation, he said, I don't know, there's no solution. We're effed, basically. People hate each other. There's no solution to this, and everyone's just upset, and there's no building trust. And I said, but there's a strange thing in the U.S. where on the conservative side, there aren't as many fact checkers as on the liberal side. Like, why is there only the Wall Street Journal that's fact checking? Can't you incentivize accuracy amongst the elites and among a party? Like I don't care if the fact checker is liberal or conservative. I just want people to care about facts. So why not have more conservative fact checkers? Why not invest in, in the UK we have The Economist, the Financial Times. They lean center right, but they score incredibly high on accuracy. And you need to have this sort of infrastructure where people on both sides of the political spectrum are being held to account, and where accuracy is a central motivation. And when you lose that, I think they partly lose it because the infrastructure isn't there to actually. So it's like, why not invest in more conservative fact checkers? And he thought that was an interesting idea. And I think we need to sort of explore the sort of representation more in hyperpolarized context, where people feel their concerns aren't represented, but perhaps they could be in a factual context, in a context that lends itself to accuracy. What I do like, the difference between the US and the UK, is that in the UK, when a politician floats a conspiracy theory, most of the elites will actually, there's a norm to not do that. So they will say, this is crazy. You can't be saying these things. You need to go and rethink, a little bit. So the party whip was removed, for example, from floating some crazy COVID conspiracy theories. So there's a kind of in-party moderation happening, saying like, we can have different opinions on policy, but you can't be spreading misinformation. And they're policing their own party. They want them to be accurate. And I think the U.S. has lost those guardrails, where now if you spread inaccurate information, you get cheered on, right? You get extra support.
Is this on both sides, the misinformation in America, like both the liberals and the conservatives? Like, did they both get cheered on with misinformation?
I don't want to engage in sort of false equivalencies. So I will say that, look, clearly liberals can believe in misinformation. Clearly people on the left can believe in conspiracy theories. We've seen Blue Anon in the US where a bunch of liberals on the extremes come up with a conspiracy that the Trump assassination was staged, which is ridiculous. Obviously that didn't happen. But there are liberal elites saying that's nonsense, stop spreading that, because that's obviously false. We don't like Trump, but that's false, right? And you need that kind of norm enforcement from elites in order for things not to go wild. And the other side is missing that at the moment, and I think that makes it spread farther and further. I mean, people do pay attention to elite cues. So even though both are susceptible to misinformation, there's hundreds of studies that show a asymmetry, right, where there is a unique echo chamber on the extreme right, and this has been quantified on Facebook and other platforms, where there's just more misinformation being produced by the top outlets like Fox News. And again, they don't have fact checkers to the same degree. They don't care about accuracy to the same degree, and so there's more spread of it on one side or the other. But clearly, both are susceptible. Some great work that one of our former postdocs at Cambridge did, who has a new book coming out, The Ideological Mind, Leah Zimrad, and she done some work using basic neurological assessments like the Wisconsin card sorting task, which is about you get a pattern, then they change the pattern, and it's to see how flexible you are in your thinking. Can you shift with the new pattern, or are you rigid and you struggle and you keep going back to the old pattern that you were trained on? And she shows that people who are strongly ideological are more rigid in their thinking. So it doesn't matter which way the ideology goes. It could be left, right, right? But at a basic level, ideology makes the brain more rigid. And it's interesting because some philosophers get upset with the idea that ideology is bad. They're sort of like, no, we need ideology. People need to be political and biased, and we need to have arguments. But actually, at the level of the brain, I would say that ideology restricts nuance. It makes people more rigid, and it makes them less open to debate, moderation, and nuance. So actually, I do think that, at least from a psychological point of view, being extreme in ideology is hardly ever a good thing. And that's true for everyone, I would say.
All right. Okay. I think we have come at a point where we have some time for audience questions.
Yes.
Let's see in the audience if there's anyone who has a question.
You can just raise your hand. Person in the back.
Don't worry, you're not being censored.
Hello. Okay. How can we combat misinformation and disinformation as a society and as an individual?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, isn't it? It's a good question. So, look, at the level of the individual, what we've tried to do is we tried to create this idea of pre-bunking, which is when you try to debunk misinformation, that's fine, but it's so much more difficult after people have already been exposed to the misinformation. One, because it taps into identity sometimes, and so people feel that it's part of who they are. Sometimes it's because of memory, and that it seeps in and it just keeps influencing people. Even when they see a fact check or a debunk, they just keep relying on it. And so can you prevent people from encoding misinformation in the first place? And that's why we've worked on this idea of pre-bunking, or trying to inoculate people beforehand. So we do a lot of work that is preventative, right? So we try to show people what are the tricks of online manipulation. We do games, we do videos, we do education, lots of stuff to try to build up this sort of psychological resistance. Put people into the shoes of an online manipulator, right? Create your own conspiracy theory in a controlled environment where you learn the tricks. I mean, and I love conversations with historians about this because they always bring up, but what about the conspiracy that really happened? But most conspiracy theories, popular ones, they follow a predictable formula, and they're all fallacious in the same way, and you can show people those building blocks so that when it actually happens to them, they can see through it and say, well, obviously Tupac Shakur is still alive on an island, Avril Lavigne's a clone, right? They're all the same. And so you can do that at the individual level, and we've shown that, I think, quite, to some extent, we've had some success with these types of interventions. But the question is, at the societal level, how do you scale that, right? And so the immunity, and this is where the metaphor is interesting, obviously, with a biological vaccine, you get 60 to 90% immunity, depending on how good the vaccine is, right? With our approach, we're talking about, I don't know, a boost of 20% in people's psychological immunity, right? And it also decays over time, and we can model the decay over time. And so you would need to vaccinate a lot of people repeatedly. So what is the mechanism for creating societal level resilience? We started out working with social media companies, and they had some good ideas at the beginning when they were motivated to try to fix the problem at least a little bit. For example, those ads you can skip on YouTube, those annoying ads, they could put the pre-bunk there, like a 30, 60-second pre-bunk of future misinformation you might see on YouTube, particularly around radicalizing, whether it's young men or other people with manipulation techniques that gurus use on YouTube. They could scale that to billions of people all at once by making them non-skippable. They did testing, works, but then they don't do it. Right? So they don't have the right incentives to fix this problem. Then you can look at governments, right? So we've done work with the World Health Organization or governments around the world. We've reached, with some public health campaigns doing this stuff, we've reached about 250 million people, which is a good chunk, but there's billions of people, obviously, in the world, and they need repetition. Now we're going back to education. Maybe we shouldn't be dependent on governments or social media companies, right? Maybe we should empower people at the individual level and have this instituted in schools from a very early age on every year, not just once, media literacy, nugget here, nugget there, good sources, bad sources. I mean, that works in some Western democracies, but in some countries, all the sources are bad. And so, right, it's more about, can you identify manipulation? Can we do that in schools before kids even start browsing the internet? In every school, in every part of the world, at every level, repeatedly. Finland is an interesting example of where they've done that, and they score extremely high on resilience to disinformation. Most of the population scores in 90th percentile on measures of literacy, numeracy, science education. And so they're a smaller country. Obviously, they share a border with Russia, so they're used to propaganda. They have an immediate threat that they're responding to. But I think other countries are not really attuned to geopolitics at the moment if they're not thinking that foreign disinformation isn't going to hit Europe and other countries to the same extent. So I think that's what we need to be doing. But then also, are you shifting blame to individuals, right? That's not what I'm saying. So, just as with climate change, I think we all have a role to play individually, but that shouldn't undermine collective action, government action, industry action, right? Same with social media. I think we all have an individual responsibility. Not everything's the fault of social media, but they are doing bad things. They're providing the wrong incentive. They control the flow of information. They can implement solutions that would help. And they're not doing it. In fact, they're doing the opposite at the moment. So government can set up independent regulators to force more top-down control in terms of getting the actors to align on their incentives. So in Europe, we have the Digital Services Act from the European Commission, which is not perfect, but it has some mechanisms to hold these companies to account. In the UK, we have the Online Safety Act. But disinformation is actually not part of it. So Ofcom, which regulates media in the UK and executes the Online Safety Act, they can do stuff about child exploitation, illegal stuff, racism, harms, but not disinformation. So the government has not actually empowered the regulator to do something. In terms of the national riots last year in the UK, those, I think, partly happened because the regulator wasn't empowered to actually tell social media companies to take this down or to do stuff about it, right? And so I think you need to have both, bottom-up and top-down processes. And I think people who advocate for just one or the other, you have that in lots of debates, public health, climate change, but obviously I think we need both.
Fair enough. Unfortunately, we won't have time for another question because we still have some things to ask. Including, because I promised the audience that we would get a bit practical. So let's say there is someone in the audience who has a family member or a friend who is deep down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories or misinformation. Is there any hope? Is there a way out? And if so, how do we get that person out?
Sure. Yeah, I can try to be brief if you want to have more time for questions. So, obviously, inoculation is not going to work for someone who's already been radicalized, right? So there's some traction you can get where people are flirting with ideas. We call therapeutic inoculation, like therapeutic vaccines. They can still boost immunity even when you're already exposed. But if somebody's been radicalized, then that's tough. I actually have family members who are conspiracy theorists. And I found that the way to deal with this is actually not to tell people, you don't know, you're wrong, here are the facts, because that often just leads them to double down on their initial position. What I try to do is I try to borrow some of the insights from the inoculation approach, which is to focus more on the meta manipulation techniques rather than getting lost in debates about specific things. So I would say avoid debates about specific issues, because they will overwhelm you with knowledge that they've read that may not be accurate. And so you don't want to go back and forth about like specific details. What you want to do is do a little bit of the Socratic method in eliciting internal doubt and questioning about why they hold their own beliefs. And so what are the actors? What are their incentives? And are you being manipulated? And so the last thing conspiracy believers want is to be manipulated, because that's the whole thing, right? They don't want to be manipulated. And so I often go like, okay, but why would Alex Jones, who's one of the most prolific conspiracy theorists in the US, tell people for a decade that the Sandy school shootings were crisis actors, and then he goes to court and says, oh no, it was definitely real, never mind. And right, so I tend to say it's a pyramid scheme. There's people at the top, they're selling this product, people in the middle spreading it, and then people at the bottom getting duped. I mean, you don't want to be the guy who's duped. You're a smart guy, right? You're a family member. We appreciate you. So you have to validate people, otherwise they're not open to what you're going to say, right? So you have to tell people in some way, like, validation can happen in many forms. If it's a family member, you would say, I love you, you're a family member, but however, right? People want to know that you care. But it could also be, some conspiracies have really happened, right? It's true. I mean, some people conspire to rob a bank, to commit fraud. I mean, that happens, right? So people do conspire to do bad things. However, so you validated that they're not crazy, right? And then you pivot to the specific discussion. But I often say, what was the incentive for Alex Jones? Why is he selling pills on his show? What are people making money off of this, right? Who's making the money? Who do you think could make money off of this? What are some of the core manipulation techniques that we should all find questionable? And I find those conversations are much easier to have because they ask the same questions. Who follow the money? What are their motivations? Don't want to be manipulated. And so sometimes you can then actually have a little bit of traction. And then you got to be satisfied and leave it there, right? So I think it's unrealistic to expect that somebody who spent months, weeks, years radicalizing themselves, that you're going to de-radicalize someone with the conversation. I mean, I see this all the time with family members. They're shouting at each other, and they're just frustrated. People are not changing their minds. You gotta get people to be a little bit more moderate. Stop, take the win, have the next conversation. But you need to have the next conversation. It's an ongoing kind of process to try to unravel this. I mean, how to get people out of cults, for example, is very interesting psychological research on this. It's much more difficult. People need a new support network. They need a new social network. You need a structural intervention, right? People whose identities become fused with an extremist group, they can't just leave that group because they have no social support. So actually the most important thing is to keep socially supporting people who are on the fringes and are not, not coming out anymore, becoming more radicalized. You're losing touch with them. The most important thing is actually to keep taking them out, to keep socializing them, to keep supporting them, because the structural element to de-radicalization is actually quite important. That the more they get out, the more they interact with other people, the less likely they are to sort of espouse the extremist beliefs. So those were the two things I think that I've tried.
Right. But I understand that it's maybe better to prevent this from happening altogether,
Yes.
someone falling for conspiracy theories.
Absolutely.
And that's also why you cooperated with social media companies like Meta and Google to develop this vaccine you have been talking about.
Yeah.
So what exactly have you been doing there? What is happening to that vaccine right now, considering the political climate? And
Yeah.
was it effective?
Well, people ask, why are you cooperating with Evil Corp? And the thing is, 5-6 years ago, they got in touch saying, we read your papers, we see your interventions, this is a cool idea, we want to help you because we also care about, not having people duped with misinformation on our platforms. And of course, you're a bit skeptical. Like, you could do lots of things, right? Obviously, the psychological intervention is the easy one for them to do because it doesn't harm engagement, it doesn't require them changing their algorithms, and it doesn't involve taking stuff down. Which is also why I'm very confused about this whole censorship debate, because, education and psychology and all of this has nothing to do with censorship, right? And but what's interesting is that they said your problem is opt-in. Education, people need to opt in. Your games, people need to opt in, right? And so you have this problem where people need to be open-minded. And so what we want to do is take some of the tools you developed, scale them on social media by making them, mandatory or non-skippable, or have billions of people exposed to it. And that was the idea. And then, of course, they need to test everything on their own platform. And it turns out they're partly right, that what works on one platform doesn't actually work on the other platform. So YouTube, for example, people watch videos. So we have, lots of success with videos. But then when you go in a scroll feed, it's a different challenge, because what works on YouTube doesn't work on a scroll feed like one of Meta's products, because you need to get people in the first hook of an Instagram reel in the first 10 seconds. They're not going to watch the whole thing. So you need to sort of redo the way that you create the vaccine, the way that you package it, and the virtual vaccine, right? So we did all of that testing for years with Meta, Google. They tested. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But by and large, they had positive results. They had a way of implementing it. And then the companies just said, policies started to change. In fact, we set up a whole preemptive misinformation management program with Meta. So I got them thinking about, your problem is you're always debunking stuff after the fact. There's always some crisis because you're not thinking ahead of how can we build resilience preemptively. So they did this whole thing. And then, of course, the Musk took over X, and then the whole landscape, the incentives changed, right? So there was no longer, public demand policy for you have to fight misinformation. Now it became, misinformation, maybe it's censoring people to do something about misinformation. Don't want to censor stuff. And I think what's important to understand is that the core of social media companies in Silicon Valley is libertarianism, right? So no intervention, absolute free speech. They don't want to be regulated. They never wanted to be regulated. They only did stuff because it was demanded of them by the users of the product, by the policies, by people who working there saying, hey, there's some stuff that's weird. There are foreign countries meddling in elections. Maybe we should have a team looking at that, right? And they act on it. But when the incentives change, they go back to their base model, which is unlimited freedom. And so so currently they're not doing anything about misinformation other than enforcing their own rules, which have been scraped back to bare minimum. They're not doing anything with all the results and all the progress that we achieved. Twitter did massive pre-bunking before Musk. Everyone's fired, completely gone.
So imagine we were to fly you out to Silicon Valley, right? You're sitting there with Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and they're being very libertarian and all of that. And they say, we don't want to fight misinformation. That's censorous.
Yeah.
Is that really true? Is it incompatible? Is there a way to fight misinformation but also upholding, this freedom of speech? Can you do both?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the political framing in the US has been very disingenuous. And so censorship is when you take stuff down, right, so that other people can't see it. Fact-checking is not censorship, right? A fact-check displays counter information in some way. It's like counter-speech, right? So it's basically, it displays some context or a label that gives people more context for how to process a piece of information. And so to label fact-checking as censorship was purely a political move to get rid of fact-checkers and people who care about accuracy. Then the algorithms. If you look at the empirical research, it actually shows the opposite. So Twitter, before Musk, was amplifying right-wing content in Germany, in the US, all around the world. And Twitter didn't actually know This was a paper that's been published, a huge team. Twitter didn't actually know this. They looked at it and said, oh, weird, our algorithm is amplifying people on the right. We don't know why. Let's look into that, right? And so it wasn't that there was some left-wing conspiracy to silence people. I think, the empirical data actually shows the opposite. Mark Zuckerberg said, oh, fact-checkers are biased. I mean, if you look at the evidence, there's a paper that was published recently. U.S. members of Congress get fact-checked at equal rates. Democrats and Republicans get fact-checked at equal rates. Democrats even get fact-checked more. But what predicts fact-checking is not partisanship, it's prominence of the politician. So yeah, the more you're out there, the more you're going to get fact-checked, right? Meta's research actually shows that if they had a fact-check on a post, people would be 90% less likely to click on it. So actually, fact-checking was effective. I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by effective. Getting people to stop believe it, influence their behavior, maybe not. But in terms of clicking on it, that or sharing it with other people, in that sense, it was effective. Inoculation, it doesn't tell people what to believe. It doesn't take down content. It just empowers people to spot the general techniques of manipulation, conspiracies, polarization, fear-mongering, discrediting, ad hominem attacks, scapegoating minority groups, so that people can make up their own mind about what they want to believe. Because I think that's the way to go, right? Even in schools, like you don't want to tell people what to think. You want people to, right, we want to teach people how to think, right? That's the whole thing about education. And so we want people to be critical consumers who think about, okay, is there a manipulation technique present? And can I make up my own mind about what I want to believe, knowing? And sometimes you might say, yeah, this was misleading, but I kind of still believe the message nonetheless. Well, at least you're informed about it, and you're free to make up your own mind. And that's sort of a free speech preserving way of actually doing this. And then there's, at a societal level, I think there's the regulation aspect, that you have to balance free speech with accountability. So in the UK, there are laws against hate speech. So like racism is illegal in the UK. You can't just go on social media and post racist stuff or hate speech. That's just illegal. It's always been illegal. It's not new. It's been 40 years at least. But they've started to enforce it more now. And so, Musk is like, oh, if you post something on social media, Starmer will send a SWAT team to your door. The UK is going down authoritarian, like Orwellian regime. I mean, it's true that if you repeatedly post racist stuff on social media, the cops will knock at your door because technically it's illegal. And they're enforcing it now, where perhaps they weren't enforcing it so much before, because I think they want to make a point. Should you go to jail for posting racist stuff on social media? I mean, I'm not a criminologist. I'm not a prosecutor. I don't know if that's the right proportionality, right? If that's ideally, we want people to have norms, values, be critical thinkers, so we don't have to do any of that, right? But I do think you need to have some form of accountability. You need to balance harm to populations with free speech. So free speech, in Europe, there have always been restrictions on some kinds of speech. So we think about free speech differently than in the U.S. Hate speech is not illegal in the U.S. You can say anything you want. So there, incitement of violence is illegal both in the U.S. and in the U.K. But the people think differently about, should you be allowed to say anything? And Europe has some experience with what happens if you're allowed to say, anything. And so let's say if there's no regulation, there's still going to be accountability. If somebody on the street tells you something that isn't true and you don't like it, there might be vigilantism. There might be personal accountability, right? But in order to make sure that people aren't personally holding each other accountable in all sorts of chaotic ways, we have some general framework that instills, right, the basic tenets.
Professor, if I may, I think we would all love to keep going, but for the
you want to censor me? Let's do it. I'm all for it.
Yes, I think we'll get to our final question.
Yes, as a final round-off, you compare yourself, actually quite funny, with Professor Snape from Harry Potter, right? Fighting against the dark arts. How do you look towards the future, And why do you make this comparison with Professor Snape from Harry Potter?
Yeah, I did make that comparison, but what happened was that one of the colleges in Cambridge started referring us to the as the defense against the dark arts lab, and so that went viral and was a big Cambridge joke, and so people started referring to me as Snape. Also because we do actually wear the robes at Cambridge, and so you know, but it wasn't my generation, so I started actually looking into the books, and what I found interesting about the dark arts metaphor was that it was very much, you know, instead of just opening a book and digesting the facts, in order to overcome the dark arts, you had to actually, you know, simulate it or like experience a little bit of it. It was dangerous almost in order to learn its tricks so you could actually overcome it. And that was actually the inspiration for the game where, you know, we started simulating what it's like to be manipulated online. It's an experiential learning kind of module. And so I took inspiration from that approach. And then, of course, the whole J.K. Rowling thing made it a bit awkward. And so, you know, now it's more of my ode to Alan Rickman, the actor, which I did very much appreciate. But yeah, that's the story behind the dark arts lab. But I should say that the last thing I'll say is that, you know, it is important to think about true information as well, right? So we all have a baseline of being able to discern things in the world, and we want people to trust true information as well, which is the flip side of the problem. So, you know, I focus a lot on the arts of manipulation, but, you know, other people focus on how can we get people to trust good sources and how can people trust media, and, you know, are journalists doing the right thing? Are they abiding by ethics? So we make sure that people trust, you know, the mainstream media and that they're doing the job and official authorities, and that's a whole different ballgame that I think is equally important. You know, it's kind of like the heuristics and biases work in psychology. That Kahneman always focused on the biases because he found that interesting, and then sometimes people got that misperception that everyone is completely biased and so on. But it's not true. People make lots of good decisions. He just found it less interesting to focus on the good decisions. Whereas, you know, I have this sort of same thing that, yeah, I mean, people trust true information, and that's all important as well. I'm just intrigued by manipulation, and that's why I focus on it.
All right, I think that concludes the interview. Everyone, please, a round of applause for Professor Sander van der Linden.
Yes.
Thanks.